Janet's disbelief was palpable as she processed Susan's decision, her eyes widening in shock at the revelation. Meanwhile, Tim voiced his concerns about Susan embarking on the trip without consulting him, fearing potential issues, particularly since she would be the only married woman among singles. He hinted at the possibility of inappropriate activities, especially in a place like Vegas. Susan's response to Tim's concerns was one of frustration, asserting her need for a break from what she perceived as his overly virtuous demeanor. She expressed feeling fed up with his Mr. Goody Two-Shoes attitude and emphasized that she had no intention of being unfaithful. According to her, their life together had become dull and lacked excitement. In contrast, Janet, a longtime friend, cautioned Susan about the potential consequences of the trip on her marriage, advising her to tread carefully. Susan, however, scoffed at the notion of passion in her marriage, describing it as far from passionate and criticizing Tim for his perceived perfection. Despite acknowledging her love for Tim, Susan vented her frustration with his lack of assertiveness and tendency to avoid conflicts. She recounted an incident at a New Year's Eve party where Tim walked away from confrontation, leaving her feeling angry and wanting to escape for a while. Janet suggested addressing the issue with Tim, urging Susan to help him become more assertive. However, Susan revealed her unsuccessful attempts in the past, citing Tim's belief that violence doesn't solve anything. Despite her forced smile, Susan's subtle hint about what transpires in Vegas staying in Vegas left Janet uneasy about her friend's emotional state. On the other hand, Tim Burns was undeniably a nice guy, standing tall at a little over 6 feet 5 inches and maintaining a trim, fit physique. His journey into adulthood began with joining the U.S. Navy straight out of high school, serving for 4 years before pursuing his dream admission to university, where he majored in finance and accounting, driven by a serious commitment to his studies despite being older than his classmates. During his junior year, Tim's academic journey took a transformative turn when he crossed paths with Susan Sims, catalyzed by a casual introduction from a mutual acquaintance in the bustling student cafeteria. The ambience seemed to shift as they exchanged glances, with Tim immediately drawn to Susan's captivating presence. Standing at an unassuming 5 feet 6 inches, Susan possessed an understated allure, her short, dark hair framing a pair of eyes that shimmered with a blend of curiosity and vitality. As their connection blossomed, the exchange of phone numbers marked the inception of a burgeoning romance. Initially, their interactions unfolded in the form of casual outings, the uncertainty of a fledgling relationship palpable in the air. However, it didn't take long for the initial hesitancy to morph into a profound emotional connection. One evening, against the backdrop of a tranquil drive back to the dormitories, Tim summoned the courage to bare his heart to Susan. In a moment brimming with vulnerability, Tim confessed his deep-seated affection for Susan, articulating his earnest desire to build a future together. Yet, Susan's response was tinged with skepticism, her probing questions challenging the authenticity of Tim's professed love. With candor, she questioned the validity of his emotions, citing the absence of substantial intimacy beyond tender gestures like hand-holding and fleeting kisses. Caught off guard by Susan's reservations, Tim endeavored to reassure her, emphasizing the sincerity of his intentions and the depth of his admiration. However, Susan's reaction was swift and impassioned, her vehement rejection of societal norms surrounding intimacy laying bare her fears and insecurities. In a flurry of emotions, she lamented the perceived inadequacies in their relationship, casting doubts on the authenticity of Tim's affection. As the conversation unfolded, it became evident that their perspectives on love and intimacy were colored by divergent life experiences. Tim's tenure in the Navy had instilled in him a sense of maturity and pragmatism, while Susan's worldview was shaped by a yearning for passion and emotional intensity. Despite their shared affection, the chasm between their expectations loomed large, leaving both Tim and Susan grappling with uncertainty about the future trajectory of their relationship. Tim reaffirmed his commitment to Susan, expressing his heartfelt desire for her to become his life partner. He poured out his emotions, articulating his aspiration to spend eternity by her side. Susan, moved by Tim's sincerity, was overcome with emotion, tears welling up in her eyes as she reciprocated his affection. She praised Tim for his unwavering kindness, considering him the epitome of sweetness, thoughtfulness, and compassion. With mutual declarations of love, they sealed their bond with a passionate kiss, the intimacy between them palpable. After Susan's graduation with a marketing degree, she secured a promising position at a cosmetics firm in the area. The salary offered exceeded her expectations, setting a solid foundation for their future. Meanwhile, Tim, with one more year to complete his degree, eagerly anticipated joining Susan in their journey together. The allure of marriage beckoned them, and they exchanged vows shortly after, establishing their home in a cozy apartment near the university. Their early years as a married couple unfolded seamlessly, buoyed by Susan's career and Tim's dedication to his studies. Upon Tim's graduation, he swiftly found employment as a junior accountant, contributing to their financial stability. The arrival of their daughter, Amanda, brought immeasurable joy, albeit shadowed by the heartbreak of Susan's health complications, which rendered further pregnancies impossible. As their careers flourished, so did their financial prosperity. With combined incomes, they were able to realize their dream of owning a spacious home in a prestigious gated community, complete with amenities like a golf course and country club. When Amanda reached adolescence, Susan made the heartfelt decision to prioritize motherhood, opting to become a full-time caregiver. Tim, in complete agreement, continued to excel in his career, eventually ascending to the position of senior account manager after over 2 decades of dedicated service. Despite his exemplary performance, Tim's aspirations for further advancement were met with disappointment when he learned he would not be promoted to the coveted vice presidency. In a meeting with the CEO, John Cook, Tim received the news with grace, masking his inner turmoil. John commended Tim for his exceptional character, lauding him for his integrity, expertise, and amiable demeanor. Despite the setback, Tim's reputation as a decent, knowledgeable, and compassionate individual remained unblemished, a testament to his enduring character. John emphasized Tim's value to the organization, citing the high regard clients held for him as a compelling reason to maintain his current position. Tim, seeking further clarification, pressed John for additional insight. Reluctantly, John admitted that Tim's niceness was a concern. He expressed apprehension that Tim might lack the assertiveness and killer instinct necessary for decisive negotiations, qualities deemed indispensable by the company. Despite Tim's silent acknowledgement of John's assessment, he chose not to dwell on that aspect, opting instead to focus on his preference for non-confrontational negotiation tactics. Departing from John's office, Tim felt the weight of disappointment settling in. He knew he had to inform Susan that the coveted promotion had eluded him, a revelation that wouldn't come as a surprise to her, given her intimate understanding of Tim's character. Seated at his desk, he found himself gazing out of the window, lost in rare introspection. Tim contemplated the deliberate persona he had crafted after his departure from the Navy, determined to distance himself from any semblance of aggression or violence. This transformation, while not without its challenges, resonated with Tim's intrinsic kindness. However, beneath the surface, a darker side lurked, one he vowed never to let resurface. As memories of his Navy years flooded back, Tim reflected on the rigorous training sessions on cold, wet beaches, the stealth operations in hostile territories, and the silent takedowns of enemy vessels at sea. For over 3.5 years, Tim had served as a Navy sea, air, and land, honing his skills as a proficient combatant in Iraq and Afghanistan. The intensity of those experiences left an indelible mark on Tim, shaping his approach to life and instilling in him a sense of discipline and resilience. In the cloak of night, Tim's presence was a testament to his resolve, his hands steady and his demeanor stoic. Renowned among his peers for his unwavering commitment and unparalleled lethality, he stood on the precipice of his military career's end with a heavy heart. The toll of years spent in service weighed heavily on his soul, and as his enlistment drew to a close, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending turmoil. Concluding his tenure with a mixture of relief and trepidation, Tim made a silent vow to himself, a promise to bury the darker aspects of his nature that had been honed and sharpened in the crucible of combat. Yet, as he stepped into civilian life, he found himself grappling with the uncertainty of his own identity. Had he gone too far in his quest to suppress the shadows within him? Was the man he had become truly who he wanted to be? As he contemplated these questions, Tim found himself at odds with the assessment offered by John Cook, the CEO of the company where he now worked. While he respected Cook's opinion, Tim couldn't help but wonder if the lack of ruthless ambition that supposedly disqualified him from a promotion was, in fact, a deliberate choice, a conscious rejection of the cutthroat mentality that seemed to permeate the corporate world. Despite his misgivings, Tim had forged a successful career, steadily climbing the ranks within the company. Yet, as he ascended, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living a double life, a facade meticulously constructed to fit the expectations of others, while his true self remained hidden beneath the surface. The cracks in this facade began to show in his personal life as well. Tim's marriage to Susan, once a source of joy and stability, had begun to fray at the edges. Their interactions were marked by tension and distance, as Sue's criticisms and Tim's efforts to avoid confrontation created an ever-widening gulf between them. As Tim grappled with the turmoil in his professional and personal life, he found himself facing a crossroads, a moment of reckoning where he would be forced to confront the truth of who he was and who he wanted to be. And as he stood on the precipice of change, uncertain of what lay ahead, he knew that the path forward would require courage, honesty, and a willingness to embrace the complexities of his own humanity. It was Jan, Carol, Peggy, and herself who planned to have some fun, instructing Tim not to make a fuss about it. Despite Tim's persistence, he inquired whether all of them were single and if the trip was appropriate. Sue abruptly switched off the TV, asserting that yes, it's entirely fitting, and proclaimed her autonomy before retreating to the bedroom, feeling the situation spiral out of control. Tim sighed, sensing that things might worsen before getting better, if they ever did. Later that evening, Tim returned home to find Sue's suitcase, a stark reminder of her upcoming Vegas trip. Curiosity led him to open it, discovering new provocative lingerie with Victoria's Secret tags, items she hadn't purchased or worn in ages. Unbeknownst to Tim, the fissures in his persona were widening. Dinner was ready, and Sue called, breaking the silence. Tim brought down the suitcase and eventually asked where she would be staying. Caught off guard, Sue replied that they would be at the Rio but advised him not to call there, using her cell instead. She assured him that if he needed to reach her, she would have it on. Tim nodded, comprehending what he needed to do. On that Friday morning, Tim woke up early, quietly preparing for work without disturbing Sue. He reached his office well before others, settling at his desk with a resolute determination. He muttered to himself that it was enough playing around, and it was time to start pulling in favors. He picked up the phone, and a female voice at the Venetian answered, asking how she could assist his call. Tim requested Ron Smith, and the voice mentioned uncertainty about whether the chief was in yet, offering to take a message. Tim insisted they try calling him anyway. The phone was answered after just one ring, and a deep voice responded with Smith. Tim spoke softly into the handset, briefing Smith on the details of his situation. There was a brief pause, and then Smith greeted Tim, acknowledging that it had been quite a few years and asking how he was. Tim replied that he needed a favor and provided Smith with the details. Smith assured Tim, "I don't care what hotel she told you, Tim, we'll find them and keep you posted. They won't be able to take a step without us knowing it. I'll be getting back to you periodically." After a moment, Smith added, "I'm sorry, Tim, you deserve better, and remember, anything you need, you just call me." Seals never forget. Tim expressed his gratitude, replaced the handset, and momentarily set the problem aside. Ron Smith, the chief of security for the Venetian, had strong connections with other hotel security heads in town. Tim had confidence that Ron would deliver on his promise. He had spent quite a few hours during the past week contemplating the course of action he intended, weighing the negatives and the potential for success. He had meticulously prepared notes and spreadsheets, foreseeing minimal drawbacks. With unwavering confidence, he decided to move forward. Reaching for the phone once more, he dialed a long-distance number. A female voice answered, and he requested to speak with Sam Carolo. The voice mentioned transferring him to Carolo's personal assistant, followed by another female voice from Carolo's office. Identifying himself as Tim Burns, he inquired about Carolo, only to be informed that Carolo was unavailable. Softly, he threatened the assistant's job if Carolo wasn't on the line within 2 minutes, instructing her to relay the message. After a brief silence, the phone was placed on a hard surface, and soon, Carolo's voice came through, expressing a mix of anger and camaraderie. Carolo noted Tim's long absence and jokingly mentioned wanting to slug him. Chuckling, Tim explained his corporate climb, acknowledging that he hadn't reached Carolo's level. As the conversation settled, Carolo expressed genuine happiness at hearing from Tim after such a long time, suggesting staying in touch and organizing a reunion with the old gang. Detecting the emotion in Carolo's voice, Tim agreed and mentioned the need to organize a reunion, but first requested a favor. Assuming it was about money, Carolo immediately offered to send some. However, Tim clarified that he didn't know the amount yet and proceeded to outline his plans, including the establishment of a line of credit for a couple of million at Carolo's bank, with the option to draw upon it as needed. Tim mentioned the possibility of additional funding and suggested discussing details such as interest rates and repayment schedules. Carolo exploded in a mix of anger and jest, expressing disdain for discussing interest repayment and playfully threatening physical harm. Chuckling, Tim assured Carolo they would discuss it later, anticipating an in-person meeting within the next couple of months. In a more serious tone, Carolo emphasized his gratitude, acknowledging that if it weren't for Tim, he wouldn't be where he is. He pledged his support, reminding Tim to call him for anything. They quickly finalized the financial details and concluded the call with promises to meet soon. Tim, realizing much of the morning had passed, summoned Pam, his secretary, and asked her to have a seat. He acknowledged her qualifications and experience, recalling their initial interview where he perceived her as overqualified due to her master's degree. Tim then proposed a proposition for Pam, asking her to relax and listen to his explanation. In Vegas, Sue and Janet, appearing a bit worn out and bleary-eyed, sat down for a late breakfast the next morning. Sue confessed to overindulging the night before, feeling awful but suggesting that it might have done her some good. She entertained the idea of repeating the experience that night, acknowledging that both of them had a bit too much fun. Janet chuckled, mentioning their luck that some of the guys they danced with didn't push things further. Sue grinned, suggesting that perhaps it wouldn't have been the case, emphasizing the mantra that what happens there stays there. Later that night, Janet found Sue waiting in the lounge and informed her that she had met someone earlier who asked her to dinner. Sue expressed her happiness for Janet and assured her that she would grab a bite, have a few drinks, and call it a night. She encouraged Janet to enjoy her dinner, and as Janet hesitated, Sue quickly reassured her and urged her to go, emphasizing that she would be fine. Janet stood up, indicating that they would see each other in their room later, and Sue smiled in agreement. After observing Janet leave the lounge and enter the lobby, Walt Hurley turned to Sue, expressing sincere apologies and assuring her that he was genuinely sorry. Sue accepted his apology, cautioning him against making more cracks and insisting on good behavior. Walt then extended an invitation for dinner, suggesting a Chinese restaurant in the hotel and expressing his desire for Sue to be his guest. Sue shook her head, smiled at him, and agreed to join him for dinner. She hesitated briefly and then shrugged her shoulders, agreeing to Walt's invitation with a reminder for him to be on his best behavior during dinner. Sue found herself pleasantly surprised at how much she enjoyed Walt Hurley's company. He was attentive, complimented her, and made her laugh. Dinner ended quickly, and Walt suggested continuing the night in the lounge for drinks and dancing. Sue's hand and suggested extending the evening. He proposed returning to the lounge for a couple of drinks and showcasing his dancing skills, joking about being real Broadway material. Sue giggled and nodded, finding Walt entertaining and feeling a strange attraction to him. The next couple of hours passed pleasantly, and Sue, feeling a bit buzzed, knew she should refuse more liquor. However, she was having fun, and Walt proved to be a great dancer. Snuggling into him on the dance floor, Sue playfully made a suggestive comment, and Walt responded with a chuckle, attributing his reaction to her being gorgeous and charming. Sue moved closer to him, remarking, "Oh no you don't. I like that, Walt. You feel huge." She pressed her lap against his hardness, feeling herself becoming more aroused. They continued dancing, with Hurley's hands on her waist, rubbing and caressing. Sue, with her hands behind his head, found herself kissing him passionately. She whispered, "Hurley, let's go up to my room. It's quieter and more private." He led her out of the lounge and into the elevators. Sue staggered along the hallway, with Hurley holding her up. "Gee, Sue, I think that you're just a little tipsy. You're a real party animal," he leered. Sue giggled again as they entered his room. Things escalated quickly as clothes were shed, and they engaged in lovemaking acts. Afterward, Sue, in a moment of clarity, realized the gravity of her actions and hurriedly left, leaving a gloating Hurley behind. On Saturday night, Tim finished a hastily prepared dinner and settled into the den with a newspaper he had no intention of reading. It dawned on him that Sue hadn't bothered to call since her departure on Friday morning. A call to the Rio confirmed that there were no registered guests by the names of Sue or her friends. Tim wasn't surprised. As the emotion surged within him, Tim felt an alien, sickening emptiness. His marriage seemed to have reached a critical point, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was over. The indifference and patronizing attitude Susan had developed over the years had eroded their connection. If she had indeed been unfaithful, the marriage might not survive, and a part of Tim would die with it. The phone's ringing interrupted his thoughts, and he answered it, hearing Ron's voice on the other end. Ron confirmed Tim's suspicions, reporting that Susan had been involved with Walt Hurley, a known player in the area. Ron offered support and advised. Upon receiving the unsettling revelation of Susan's infidelity involving Hurley, Tim found himself engulfed in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Ron's advice to take a moment to process the news and his assurance of confidentiality provided a brief respite, but the weight of the situation bore down heavily on Tim. He sat in stunned silence, his hands trembling as tears streamed down his face, each droplet a testament to the profound sadness and desolation that had engulfed him. The woman he had loved and trusted had betrayed him, shattering the very foundation of their relationship. As the initial shock subsided, a tidal wave of anger surged within Tim. Vengeful thoughts of retribution against Hurley flashed through his mind, fueled by the raw intensity of his emotions. Yet, amidst the tumult of his inner turmoil, a flicker of self-awareness illuminated his consciousness. Tim recognized the perilous precipice upon which he stood, teetering between succumbing to his suppressed instincts and upholding the person he had painstakingly strived to become. With a determined resolve, he fought against the primal urges threatening to consume him, steadfast in his commitment to resist regression. However, even as Tim grappled with the betrayal and its aftermath, he knew that decisive action was imperative. Accepting the grim reality that his marriage was irreparably damaged, he could no longer bear the thought of sharing the same space with Susan. Gathering his belongings and securing temporary accommodations, he braced himself for the impending confrontation with Susan upon her return. Meanwhile, Susan and Janet embarked on a somber journey home, the weight of their strained friendship palpable in the air. Janet's concern for their bond was evident as she gently urged Susan to confront the repercussions of her actions. Despite the tension between them, Janet offered unwavering support, reminding Susan of the importance of facing the truth, no matter how painful. As they bid farewell, Sue's heart weighed heavy with regret, her steps faltering under the burden of her mistakes. Janet's parting words echoed in her mind, a poignant reminder of the difficult road ahead. With each step homeward, Sue carried the weight of her actions, uncertain of what the future held but determined to confront the consequences head-on. Sue entered the house, her head shaking slightly as she lifted her chin. Spotting Tim in his easy chair, she greeted him with a brave smile, mentioning their enjoyable trip but expressing relief at being home. However, Tim's cold gaze met her, and he insisted she sit down to discuss her journey. Though his tone was soft, there was an unmistakable force beneath it, a demeanor Sue had not encountered before. Caught off guard, Sue hesitated but quickly composed herself, citing fatigue and the need for a shower before delving into the details of the trip. Tim, issuing a subtle threat, demanded she stay and listen. Sue, taken aback, questioned his sudden change in behavior, asserting her right to postpone the conversation. In response, Tim rose abruptly, his proximity to Sue now imposing, as he issued a veiled threat about resorting to physical force if she didn't comply. With a gentle push, he guided her into the chair, leaving Sue in disbelief at the unfamiliar aggression. Deciding to humor him, Sue began recounting the trip with the girls, detailing their escapades. Tim's gentle inquiry about the purpose of the getaway sparked a defensive response from Sue, who questioned if escaping from him had been her primary motive. Expressing exhaustion and bewilderment, Tim insisted on continuing the conversation, probing Sue about her interactions with other men behind his back. With fear gnawing at her heart, Sue wondered if Tim's accusations were based on concrete evidence or mere suspicion. In a vehement denial, Sue countered Tim's accusations, accusing him of being irrational and intoxicated. Tim, however, maintained a calm demeanor, accusing Sue of adultery and deceit. He revealed his knowledge of her affair with Hurley in Vegas, casting doubt on the sincerity of their relationship. As Tim paused, seemingly lost in thought, Sue silently lamented her folly. His disbelief at ever loving her cut deep, and Sue realized the extent of her betrayal. With a heavy heart, she faced the harsh reality of her actions, knowing that their relationship might be beyond repair. As Tim sat there, grappling with the shattered remnants of his marriage, a storm of emotions raged within him. The revelation of Susan's infidelity with Hurley hit him like a freight train, leaving him reeling in disbelief and anguish. Ron's voice on the other end of the phone confirmed his worst suspicions, plunging him into a maelstrom of heartache and betrayal. Unable to respond immediately, Tim felt a torrent of emotions flood over him, overwhelming him with a sense of devastation. Tears streamed down his face uncontrollably as he trembled, his hands gripping the arms of his chair with a vice-like grip. The profound sense of sadness and desolation that enveloped him was suffocating, as if the very foundations of his world had crumbled beneath him. In that moment, Tim felt like a stranger to himself, confronted with a reality he never could have imagined. The woman he had loved and trusted had betrayed him, casting aside their vows and the sanctity of their marriage for the fleeting thrill of infidelity. The pain of her betrayal cut deep, leaving a gaping wound in his heart that seemed impossible to heal. As anger began to replace the initial shock, Tim found himself fixating on Hurley with vengeful thoughts swirling in his mind. The urge to lash out, to seek retribution for the pain he had been subjected to, surged within him like a tidal wave. But even as he entertained thoughts of violence, a voice of reason whispered in the back of his mind, reminding him of the person he had become. Suppressing his instinctual urge to retaliate, Tim fought to maintain control over his emotions, resisting the temptation to descend into darkness. He reminded himself of the values he held dear, of the person he had strived to be, a man guided by principles of integrity, compassion, and restraint. It was a struggle against his own nature, a battle to resist the pull of the darkness that threatened to consume him. Amidst the turmoil of his emotions, Tim knew that decisions had to be made, choices that would shape the course of his future. With a heavy heart, he acknowledged that the marriage was effectively over, irreparably broken by Susan's betrayal. The thought of continuing to share a life with her was unbearable, each moment spent in her presence a painful reminder of the trust that had been shattered. Summoning his resolve, Tim made preparations to confront Susan upon her return, steeling himself for the difficult conversation that lay ahead. He packed his belongings, securing hotel reservations as he braced himself for the inevitable confrontation. With each passing moment, the weight of his decision bore down on him, a burden too heavy to bear alone. As they gradually gathered a core group of interested parties and received tentative interest from potential clients, the divorce proceedings unfolded relatively smoothly. Despite Sue's persistent attempts to reach out and perhaps reconcile, Tim remained steadfast in his decision to keep his distance. The finalization of the divorce came relatively quickly, a matter of mere months, marking the official end of Tim's marriage to Sue. Throughout this tumultuous period, Tim maintained communication with his daughter Amanda, who often relayed her mother's earnest desire for reconciliation. Amanda pleaded with her father to reconsider, reminding him of Sue's distraught state and her willingness to do anything to salvage their marriage. However, Tim stood firm in his resolve, explaining to Amanda that such a prospect was out of the question for him. Meanwhile, in his office one day, Tim received a FedEx delivery from Doug Clean, his attorney. Upon the receptionist's inquiry, Tim instructed her to bring it in. Yet, when faced with the large brown envelope containing the final divorce documents, he hesitated. The weight of its contents, the acknowledgement of his newly single status, bore down on him, stirring up a mix of emotions he thought he had resolved. Seated in silence, Tim grappled with a wave of sadness and introspection. He couldn't help but recognize his own part in the dissolution of his marriage, regretting his passivity in addressing the issues that had plagued their relationship. However, he also understood that ultimately, it was Sue's decision, a decision she, as a grown woman, had made fully aware of the consequences. Despite his efforts to move forward, Tim couldn't shake off the lingering shadow of Walter Hurley. A couple of months post-divorce, he made the decision to frequent a bar known to be one of Hurley's haunts, located conveniently close to his office. As weeks passed, Tim found himself drawn to the place, and one early evening, amidst the loud and raucous voices, he recognized the unmistakable tone of Hurley's arrogance permeating the air. Tim's journey through the aftermath of his divorce was marked by introspection, regret, and a lingering sense of unfinished business. Yet, amidst the turmoil, he found a newfound sense of determination to confront the ghosts of his past and carve out a new path for himself. "I've been involved with half a dozen married women in recent months. They're all promiscuous when it comes down to it," he laughed, surrounded by his entourage. Tim moved toward the entrance of the room, catching Hurley's attention. Well, look who's here. How's it going, Timmy? Susie finally kicked you out, huh? Guess you couldn't measure up after me," Hurley jeered, laughing obscenely. "Why do you think any woman would desire someone like you, Walt? A rubber toy would be a better option." "I've heard you struggle to get your little weenie up half the time," Tim retorted deliberately, his gaze fixed on his target. "You're a little prick. I'll teach you to respect your betters," Hurley roared, charging at Tim. The sequence of events unfolded swiftly, and suddenly, Hurley found himself thrust back into a table, collapsing under his weight. He rose with fire and hatred, clutching an empty beer bottle with murderous intent. "You idiot. I'll eliminate you for that," Hurley muttered, charging again. Within seconds, he was on the floor, his subsequent medical examination revealing a fractured spine, a broken pelvis, a ruptured spleen, and significant damage to his testicles. An emergency call summoned an ambulance and the police, but Tim's actions were deemed self-defense, resulting in no charges. Once the commotion settled, Tim left the bar for home. His satisfaction stemmed not from causing damage to Hurley, but from maintaining control and refraining from a potentially fatal outcome. He mused to himself that sometimes a bit of violence might be the solution to a problem. In the subsequent months, Tim's new company thrived. He ensured hiring top-notch personnel with expertise, rewarding them accordingly. Clients were treated with respect, fairness, and consideration for their best interests, contributing to the business's success. Despite heading a prosperous enterprise, Tim found himself discontented. He avoided delving into the reasons, refusing to dwell on lost love, keeping this sentiment to himself, sharing it with no one.